Hi, it's Alex. Today I want to look at Luke 14, verses 12 to 14, with a focus on the relationship of ground. The ground is an important relationship that you're going to see often. It's the relationship, you remember, between a statement and the argument or the reason for that statement. And we're going to be looking for keywords like for or because or since. So let me walk through Luke 14, 12 to 14 here and give you an example of how I would arc out this passage with a focus particularly on ground. Luke 14, 12 to 14. He also said to the man who had invited him. You remember this is the passage where Jesus is at the home of the Pharisee. He's been invited over to dinner there. He said to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your relatives or your rich neighbors." So we can see this series of people that Jesus is saying not to invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, lest, a key word, they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Seems like we have a corresponding list here in this next sentence. And you will be blessed, because, one of our key words, particularly for ground, because they cannot repay you. A strange statement. You will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For, another word that points us to the relationship of ground, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So let me show you how I would arc this passage. I've written out this passage in its propositions, and I want to begin to look at the relationship between the propositions. I decided to write this out, this introductory formula. He also said to the man who had invited him, and then the rest of the passage we have what Jesus actually said. We have this first proposition: when you give a dinner or a banquet, or when you give a dinner or a banquet. So we have two propositions. Then do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors. So I've listed that out, each proposition, lest, wonderful keyword, they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, this corresponding list to what we had up above. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So now, where my eye goes to begin to define the relationships between these propositions is to this opening statement. He also said to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner. And that's really the rest of these three verses that we have is what Jesus said. So I see an explanation here of this opening statement. So I'm going to label this immediately as an idea, and then I'm going to draw one large arc over the whole rest of this passage and label that as an explanation of this idea. So in that way, I'm going to work from the top down, and then I'm going to come back to the details of the content of what Jesus actually said to the man. And the first thing I see is temporal, when you give a dinner or a banquet. And so we have this alternative set here. So I'm going to label this as an alternative. When you give a dinner or a banquet. And I said we have this temporal word, and we'll see what it relates to here. It's this exhortation right here. Do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors. So we have another series of coordinate relationships that are set in an alternative to each other. So I'm going to go ahead and label those as well as alternative. and draw my arc over those 4 statements. Do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors. And I see this temporal relationship as defining when you have a dinner. This is what Jesus says not to do. So we have a temporal relationship. When you give a dinner, don't do this. And then he gives this reason right here, lest, this purpose, and yet that purpose is made up of 2 parts, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. So we have a short series here that I want to take time to define, and then I want to come back and define this action and purpose that Jesus is exhorting the man who had invited him. Don't invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors, lest, for this purpose, they also invite you in return and you be repaid. Jesus is warning him about being repaid, at least in the short term, right, as we'll see. So that's how I would arc that first sentence. Let's move on to this next sentence. But when you give a feast, so we're going to have maybe another alternative here, but when you give a feast, this is what he says to do. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. So we have this same kind of relationship that we had here, a temporal statement and a list. We have a temporal statement and a list. So I'm going to go ahead and define this list. Invite the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind here in a series. And this is also parallel to what we saw above, a temporal statement. When you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and an additional statement that Jesus makes here, and when you do this, you will be blessed. So we have an additional, after this list, we have an additional statement that is said in series by the word and you will be blessed. When you do this, you will be blessed. And then we're given a reason with this word because. This is the key word that sets off this reason, this ground. Why will you be blessed when you give a feast and invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind? You'll be blessed for the strange reason, Jesus says, because they cannot repay you. You will be blessed because they cannot repay you. So this is Jesus' reason that he's giving. So I'm going to label this as the ground for this sentence. And then we come to this last statement, and it's interesting because we've already had one reason. Why are you blessed? If you give a feast and invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and they can't repay you, or why are you blessed? The reason that you're blessed, Jesus says, is because they can't repay you. That's the ground or the undergirding of this blessing that he's describing when you do this. Now he gives a further reason, a further ground statement here for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So Jesus is looking further into the future to the resurrection of those who are justified before God, and says the reason you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, this further reason is because, or for, you will be repaid, not because there's no payment at all, but because you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now the challenge that I see here is whether this further ground relates just to what we saw here in verses 13 and 14, or whether it relates to everything that Jesus has said. This makes me look back at this first example that Jesus sets in contrast with this second example. And I already noted this word but as a potential key word for this relationship right here. But when I noticed that, it also made another word stand out, this not. And a negative and positive relationship. And we certainly have that in this first example that Jesus gives of what not to do. And then he tells us what to do. And then I think that further is undergirded. Both of those are undergirded by this last ground statement. So I'm going to try this out and label this as a negative and a positive. Draw my arc over these two sets of propositions. And then label this last statement, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just, as a ground statement. And I already have my arc over this whole, which relates this ground statement then to both of these examples, this negative positive relationship of what not to do and what to do when you give a feast, that Jesus says. Because he wants us to be looking to the repayment that's going to be happening at the resurrection of the just. Jesus uses this relationship of ground to get at our motivation, doesn't he? Where in this first example, we are tempted toward immediate payment, right? The reason this person is entering into these relationships is really not relational, but it's really transactional, right? It's really commercial because he wants to be repaid. The only reason he can think of to have a banquet is to invite those people who could also repay him in this life. But Jesus says there's a better payment. There's a better payment that's coming, because look at the contrast here. This desire for immediate payment, this motivation, versus this motivation, where there is a blessing because they cannot repay. It's this upside down value system that Jesus puts forward in the Gospels. The values of the kingdom that are upside down to the values of this world. This negative and positive contrast. Don't give a banquet to be repaid in this life. Rather, give a banquet where you won't be repaid in this life, but you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Not because, to make it plain, not because there's no payment, but the ground, the foundation, the undergirding of all of our relating is that we can give freely to the people around us in this life, because we have this hope of God's free generosity that we're going to have, that we have promised to us now and that we'll experience at the resurrection of the just. That is, of all those who are justified freely by his grace, all that we'll receive freely from God's hand. And so this ground statement, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just, is the reason that undergirds both examples that Jesus gives here. And that's just an example of the relationship of ground and how I would walk through and arc Luke chapter 14, 12 to 14.